So one of the questions that people often ask is how could something that happens inside of our bodies possibly have any influence, any effect over what happens beyond our bodies, beyond the boundary of our skin and our flesh? How could it possibly influence the world around us? I think maybe the best way to help explain that from my understanding is through a story. I live in the high desert of northern New Mexico, about an hour from the nearest town and about a mile from the nearest neighbor. So it's a very isolated, remote, pristine, magnificently beautiful part of the world. And in the early 1990s, the high desert of northern New Mexico was in a severe drought, the worst in over 100 years that the elders remembered. Cattle were suffering, crops were dying, and it was really bad. And a native friend of mine, and I'll call him David to honor his privacy. I call him David so much that when I see him now, I actually think of him as David. Called me one day. David called me and he said, "Gregg, would you like to join me in a place that our ancestors built so long ago we don't even know who built this medicine wheel where it is today? Would you like to join me in that place for a prayer of rain?" And I didn't have to think twice. I said, "Sure, absolutely, I'd love to." And I wasn't prepared for what David showed me that day, because I had an expectation that I would see some chanting, some dancing, some kind of movement, some kind of a ceremony, and that's not what I saw at all. We hiked across 130,000 acres, the most fragrant high desert sage. It's the kind that releases its scent when your knees brush up against the little leaves. It's just beautiful. And we arrived at this ancient medicine wheel. And David sat down. He unlaced the shoes, his old work boots, and with his naked feet, he stepped into the center of this wheel. And he turned his back to me, and he closed his eyes, and he held his hands in a prayer mudra just for a few seconds in silence. And then he turned and looked at me and he said, "I'm hungry. You want to go get a bite to eat?" And I was shocked. I said, "Yeah, at some point," I said, "but I thought you were going to pray for rain." And this is the key. This is why I'm sharing the story. He looked from inside that circle right into my eyes. He said, "No." He said, "If I prayed for rain, rain could never happen. Because the moment we ask for something to happen, we have just acknowledged to the universe that it does not exist. Now, we've just affirmed that it doesn't exist. We've affirmed the very thing that we're praying to change." And I said, "Well, if you didn't pray for rain, what did you do?" He said, "When I closed my eyes," he said, "I felt the feeling of what it feels like when it rains in our Pueblo village." He said, "I smelled the smells of what it smells like when the rain rolls off the earthen walls of my Pueblo home. And I felt the feeling of my naked feet in the mud, and the mud is there because there's been so much rain. And I gave thanks of gratitude and appreciation for the rain that has already happened." We went into the nearest town, to Taos, New Mexico, and we had lunch. And by the time I got back up onto my property that afternoon, I saw something that we hadn't seen for a long time. Big black clouds came in over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and by nightfall, it started to rain. And it rained and rained and rained. It rained all night. It rained all the next morning, the next afternoon. It rained and rained, and it didn't stop. It rained so much. The fields were flooded, the roads were flooded, cattle were stranded, and I called my friend David on the phone. And I said, "David, what in the world is this?" I said, "This is a mess." I said, "Everything is just covered with rain." I said, "It's flooding everywhere." And he was silent just for a moment. And he said, "Gregg, that's the part of the prayer the ancestors could never figure out." He said they could bring the rain, they couldn't tell it how much rain to bring. So when I tell that story, I have to say that scientifically, I cannot say as a scientist that David's prayer created the rain. What I can say is there's a high correlation between the time that prayer was offered and when the clouds came in that had not been there for months in that localized geographic area. I watched the weather reports from the TV stations that we're able to bring in nearby communities. And I saw the weatherman from Denver, Colorado, as he was looking at the jet stream. And the jet stream was coming across the west. And as it got to Wyoming, it dipped down into Colorado and down into New Mexico and made a little turn and came right back up, right over the place where the rain had happened. And the weatherman stepped back and he simply said, huh, because he hadn't seen anything like this.
Hat dir dieses Video gefallen? Gib uns ein Zeichen und lasse einen Daumen nach oben da. Bist du interessiert an weiteren solchen kostenlosen Videos? Dann abonniere unbedingt unseren Kanal und drücke die Benachrichtigungsglocke, denn nur so stellst du sicher, dass du kein weiteres Video verpasst. Danke dir und bis zum nächsten Video.